Hey everyone, Jeremy Maestas here again with NRCS. And in this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the broad umbrella of low tech approaches. And after I do that here briefly, will be followed by more specific presentations by Steve Bennett and Scott Shaverdian on the post-assisted log structures and beaver dam analogs that we'll focus on mostly in this workshop. And for reference, I'd point you to chapters 1 and 4 in your design manual. The first thing we should acknowledge is that low tech isn't new. This concept has been around a long time. In fact, in Europe, in the US, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were doing a lot of work on erosion control using what we would now call low tech methods. More recently, we've had great publications put out by folks like Bill Zeedyke from the Southwest. His book called Let the Water Do the Work really embodies this concept of low-tech process-based restoration. And then also NRCS has been involved with our stream bank soil bioengineering work over the last 2 decades using natural plant materials and whatnot to address stream erosion issues. There's a really cool publication Forest Service put out in 1934 called the Handbook of Erosion Control in Mountain Meadows. And I would really encourage you to track this down when you have some time. There's a link there at the bottom. But it contains some great ideas, low-tech structures, and even some principles, early ideas about principles of how these types of structures should be viewed, including things like numerous low dams are preferable to one. It's more economical to do restoration in stages. And temporary rather than permanent structures are preferred. And so we're borrowing and building upon a really great history of doing low tech around the world. In what may be the craziest example of low tech, at one time when we got back from World War II, we were dumping live beavers out of airplanes with parachutes to reintroduce them into areas where perhaps they'd been extirpated. And some really great historical content here from Idaho, and it worked. There were researchers following these critters, and the survival rate was relatively high when they hit the ground, and then folks saw the value in putting beaver back because of concerns about flooding and other issues. And so this concept and the importance of beaver has been recognized for some time. So what are some of the common ingredients of low tech? And I think the desired attributes include, first and foremost, it's simple. And there's always this drive to be cost effective so that we can efficiently scale up restoration to match the scope of degradation. Structures, if we need them at all, are handcrafted using locally sourced and natural materials whenever we can. And this idea of letting the system do the work, this process-based approach, is really foundational. And whether that's the flow regime or critters like beaver, or the plants, those are all components that if we can enlist the help of nature, we don't have to spend as much of our own resources and diesel power trying to force the system back to something we want it to be. And if we employ those elements, we're able to engage a much broader audience in restoration. This is really a blue-collar conservation approach that gets more people off of the sidelines watching and actually into the valley bottom, helping us fix more miles of stream. And so just a quick collage, I guess, of the variety of things we might consider low tech. Grazing management, a big deal in the western U.S. where most lands are grazed. Of course, the time and timing of grazing is really important. So it's not just about excluding livestock, but managing the time and timing of grazing to promote that riparian vegetation and the biology that allows for functioning floodplain systems. Beaver management. This could include things like active translocation or simply managing trapping in areas and strategic places where we want to promote that process. It could also include coping mechanisms for landowners, that have to deal with flooding or road culvert blocking issues. There are techniques to live with beaver so we can get the ecosystem benefits. Brush placement. If we look at some of the low-tech stuff, just simply dumping wood into incised channels sometimes is enough to kickstart processes. If we want to be a little more targeted, direct tree felling is a option that is very useful to place wood in places that we want to kickstart the recruitment of additional wood in the future. Of course, riparian plantings. We do a lot of that around the West, and that's a big part of getting that biological components that's so important to these stream systems back. What we're going to focus on is kind of this last bucket. I call it sticks and stones approaches, and we won't tackle necessarily the upper headwater meadow restoration techniques that Bill Zeedyk has pioneered, the one rock dams and other types of structures with rock. We'll focus mainly on perennial systems and the structures that you'll learn more about here coming up next, post-assisted log structures and beaver dam analogs, mainly these woody type structures. I also want to point out in your design manual, chapter 1, this table has a list of references related to a lot of those different techniques, and I'd encourage you to follow up and explore those further. So bringing it back home to what will be the focus of the entirety of our workshop, our contribution to the low-tech toolbox is really this process-based restoration package. And so I will just reread this definition that Joe introduced you to earlier. A practice of using simple, low unit cost structural additions like wood or beaver dams to riverscapes to mimic functions and promote specific processes. Hallmarks of this approach include an explicit focus on promoting geomorphic and fluvial processes in a conscious effort to use cost-effective low-tech treatments. For example, hand-built, natural materials, non-engineered, short-term design life, because we need to efficiently scale up application. And we can defer a lot of that critical decision making to the system, which takes some of the risk off of us as well. So this will be the focus of our workshop, and you'll hear more about it over the coming presentations. Now, again, bringing it back home from a personal perspective, this might help other agencies that are struggling with the same question of where does low-tech PBR fit into what we do? Well, I'll just tell you a quick story. About 5 years ago when we learned about these techniques and we're very interested in incorporating them into our toolbox, we brought our interdisciplinary team together and kind of, explored the different possibilities. We really had to challenge the existing paradigm, which, is mostly engineering-based solutions to stream restoration. And so what we ended up landing on was this practice, this biology practice. It's for those that speak NRCS, it's code 643, restoration of rare or declining natural communities. And in that practice, that broad practice where we do a lot of different activities, it really had some key elements that we were attracted to. One is this focus on kind of reestablishing those processes and physical conditions that allow these rare riparian resources in the West to function properly. It also had a short design life. In other words, a 1-year lifespan is all we would expect with the structures that we build under this practice. And that's actually very different than an engineering based practice where most of them are a minimum of 15-year design life. So that's critically important to our planners because you end up building structures that are much more reinforced if you have to make them last for 15 years. So that flexibility in terms of lifespan was really critical. And again, the focus back on this purpose of process-based restoration. For those of you that don't know, NRCS helps administer the Farm Bill. Farm Bill is the world's largest source of conservation funding. We provide technical and financial assistance to private landowners that own 2/3 of the U.S. and helping them improve their natural resources and be more sustainable in ag production. So we're able to now fund this kind of work under the Farm Bill for the first time, and we're doing it through this practice 643. We have a payment scenario, if you're familiar with that, national payment scenario number 50, that specifically is for beaver dam analogs and post-assisted log structures. So if you work with NRCS, or perhaps you don't know us, you should visit our local USDA service center and ask about opportunities to help cost share with this work on private lands. And we're excited to be rolling it out. It's fairly new for us, but we have worked through a lot of the details that I think many agencies are going to have to work through themselves given the existing paradigm we've built for stream restoration. Okay, so now I'm going to wrap it up and you'll hear more details about PALs and BDAs. Thanks.